In medieval times, if you wanted the latest gossip, royal announcements, or the thrilling news that pig taxes were going up again, you didn't check your phone. You checked your ears. Because that's when the town crier came marching down the street, ringing a bell like his life depended on it, which, in some cases, it sort of did. Dressed in flamboyant robes, because subtlety wasn't invented yet, a feathered hat large enough to scare birds, and holding a heavy brass bell, the town crier was the loudest man in the village, both literally and socially. His outfit wasn't just for style. It screamed, "Look at me! I'm about to yell important things at you whether you want me to or not." His job was simple but exhausting. Deliver every official announcement to every ear in town, whether that ear was on a nobleman, a fishmonger, or a very confused chicken. He'd walk to the busiest street corner, raise his bell, and ring it with flair, sometimes with enough gusto to wake the dead, or at least startle the nearby blacksmith into dropping his hammer. Then came the signature shout, "Hear ye! Hear ye!" If people didn't hear ye, he'd just keep yelling until they did. Now let's talk logistics. These proclamations weren't memorized. He carried scrolls, long, winding scrolls, that sometimes read like legal novels. And he had to read them clearly and dramatically. Because if you mispronounced "land reassignment by order of the crown" as "lamb reassignment by order of the clown," you could find yourself reassigned to the nearest dungeon. Town criers were the original live streamers, except you couldn't mute them, and they didn't wait for you to finish your stew. If the king had a message, you were going to hear it, in the middle of your lunch, in the rain, or while half asleep outside the tavern. But let's not pretend it was glamorous. While the crier was technically a royal servant, his working conditions were awful. He had to shout over horses, pigs, noisy children, and that one drunk guy who always tried to argue with him mid-announcement. And the weather? Rain? Too bad. Snowstorm? Bundle up. Sweltering sun? Sweat and shout. Because news waits for no man, and especially not for someone who forgot to bring an umbrella in the 14th century. One might think, with such a role, they were beloved. Actually, no. If the crier announced tax hikes or new curfews, villagers sometimes responded by booing, throwing cabbages, or muttering curses under their breath like, "May your bell rust and your scrolls get soggy." Still, it wasn't all doom and gloom. The crier was respected. Some towns even made it illegal to interrupt, insult, or injure one, which made sense, because this was a guy shouting government secrets with zero backup. Off-duty, town criers would often unwind at local inns, sipping warm ale, their voices hoarse, their throats sore, but their dignity mostly intact. Unless they tripped on their own robe in front of the mayor's wife early. In the grand scheme of medieval madness, the town crier was part herald, part performer, part walking notification bell. He was the man who brought you the news, whether you liked it or not, and did it loudly, proudly, and in feathered hats that would make even a pirate jealous. Let's be honest, medieval life wasn't glamorous. People lived close together, plumbing was a fantasy, and sanitation, well, it was mostly a good luck situation. But someone had to deal with what people left behind. Enter the gong farmer. No, he didn't grow gongs. He wasn't a percussion specialist. And he certainly didn't work in music. The word gong, in this case, came from an Old English word for, well, go. Yes, that kind of go. The gong farmer's entire job, his noble, unfortunate calling was to remove human waste from cesspits, latrines, and privies. In other words, he shoveled poop for a living. Professionally. Nightly. Repeatedly. Imagine this. It's 2 a.m., the village is asleep, the moon is full, and the streets are silent, except for the soft squelch of boots sinking into mud, and the unmistakable slosh of a wooden bucket filled with medieval regret. That's the gong farmer, starting his shift. Gong farmers only worked at night. Not because it was spooky and romantic, but because no one wanted to see, or smell, what they were doing. They'd descend into pits beneath castles, monasteries, or public latrines, sometimes digging 6 feet deep, to remove the night's soil, with long-handled scoops and buckets. The brave ones climbed down themselves. The smell? Let's just say, there are no words. Imagine a mix of spoiled cabbage, wet dog, bad decisions, and last month's stew, simmering for weeks under a wooden floor. Now imagine diving into it. They'd hoist it out bucket by bucket, loading it into carts or barrels, then wheeled it out of town, because dumping it nearby would be considered rude, and also biowarfare. Some waste was used as fertilizer. Yes, the same bucket of horror could one day help grow your carrots. It's a cycle of life. A very smelly one. Now, let's be fair. Gong farmers were paid surprisingly well, sometimes twice or even triple what a regular laborer made. But that came at a cost. They were socially shunned, often forced to live outside city walls, and sometimes even banned from churches or taverns because, well, the smell doesn't wash off easily. Imagine walking into a bar after your shift and the bartender just silently points to the door. Again. Worse still, it was dangerous work. The cesspits could collapse. The gases were toxic. Some gong farmers died on the job, suffocating in a pit of filth. Which is a pretty terrible way to go, historically speaking. And yet, they were essential. Without them, disease would spread faster than a bad rumor. Gong farmers kept cities functioning, quietly, unpleasantly, and with a certain squelchy dignity. You could ignore them, laugh at them, even avoid eye contact, but without them, your castle would be full of crap. Literally. So next time you flush a toilet, say a silent thank you to the unknown, underpaid, oversmelled gong farmers of the past, the unsung heroes of hygiene, the midnight warriors of waste, the men who gave a whole new meaning to dirty job. Now, let's talk about medieval fashion. Those elegant wool cloaks, those neatly pleated robes, those flowing gowns nobles like to swish around in castles. Someone had to process that wool to make it soft, wearable, and not smell like a wet sheep. That someone was the fuller. Yes, before that cloak graced the king's shoulders, it passed through the hands. And we'll get to this, the bare feet of a fuller. Because fulling wasn't sewing or tailoring. No. It was stomping. In wet, dirty wool. All day. And what made it dirty wasn't mud. It was worse. Let's break it down. When wool came off the sheep, it was greasy, full of lanolin, dirt, dung, and other outdoor flavors. To clean and thicken it, they had to do what was called fulling, basically pounding, kneading, and soaking the wool until it was clean, tight, and fluffy. So how do you knead wool in the 1300s? Simple. You stick it in a trough of water, mix in a generous helping of stale urine, then get in barefoot and stomp. That's it. That's the job. You're now dancing in a pea puddle with some wet wool. Why urine? Great question. Back then, People didn't have strong chemical detergents. But urine contains ammonia, which is excellent at breaking down oils and grease. So when people relieved themselves, they didn't flush, they saved it in buckets, sometimes called chamber lye. That's right. People donated their pee to the local fuller's tub, like a community bodily fluid drive. Some cities even taxed urine collection because it was such a valuable cleaning agent. So while everyone else was ignoring their chamber pots, fullers were like, "Ah, a fresh donation. Excellent vintage." Now, the fuller didn't just tiptoe around. He'd stomp, twist, shuffle, and spin for hours, until the wool was thick and fluffy. It was kind of like doing grape stomping for wine, except instead of Merlot, you're brewing woolly urine soup. And you couldn't just slap on sandals and call it a day. This was barefoot stomping, sometimes in cold weather, on slippery stone floors, and for 10 to 12 hours a day. If you were lucky, you worked in a small workshop with a team. If you were unlucky, you worked in a tiny shed behind someone's house with buckets of communal pee and wet sheep fluff slapping against your legs. Fullers were not popular folks. Like gong farmers, they often smelled like their work, like wet wool mixed with a faint hint of last night's ale and this morning's outhouse. People didn't want to sit next to a fuller at the tavern. They also didn't want to live near one. So fullers were usually shoved to the edges of towns, downwind, and well out of the sight of polite society. But despite all this, the job was essential. Without fullers, no one had warm clothes. Nobles couldn't swish, monks couldn't wear their robes, and peasants would be even itchier than usual. Eventually, the invention of fulling mills in the late Middle Ages made the process slightly less horrible. Big wooden hammers powered by water wheels replaced some of the stomping. But for many long, wet, smelly centuries, the wool of the world was cleaned the old-fashioned way. With feet. In pee. So next time you throw on a cozy wool sweater, take a moment to thank the medieval fullers, the unsung foot-stomping, pea-slopping, fluff-pounding textile heroes who helped fashion history stay warm, and only mildly disgusting. You know how, in most religions, if someone sins, they're supposed to confess, do penance, or maybe get spiritually grilled by a priest? Well, what if the person is dead? Enter the Sin Eater. Yes, this was a real job. A man, always a man, because medieval sexism never missed a beat, was hired to eat sins. Literally. With bread. And maybe a beer. Sounds like a joke? It was very real, and somehow even weirder than it sounds. Baguette bread, how it worked. Picture this, someone in a village dies. Let's say it's Farmer Thomas. He wasn't a bad man, but maybe he borrowed a chicken and never gave it back. Maybe he cussed at the baker. Maybe he once lied about his turnip harvest. The usual. But Farmer Thomas didn't confess before dying. Oh. In medieval Christian belief, this was a problem. If you die with unconfessed sins, your soul could be stuck in purgatory, or worse, taking a one-way trip to the eternal furnace. The family, desperate to secure his passage into heaven, would call for a sin eater. And the sin eater would arrive, quietly, hunched, usually poor, a social outcast, like some gothic Uber Eats delivery guy, but in reverse. He would sit at the side of the corpse, where the family had placed a piece of bread and sometimes a mug of ale on the dead body's chest. Yes, on the chest. That bread was now considered to be spiritually infused with all the dead person's sins. As in murder, theft, jealousy, gluttony, all of it, baked into a crunchy little sourdough slice. And the sin eater? He'd eat it. He'd eat the sins. Here lies Thomas, who once stole a pig. I accept this pig stealing into my belly. May he rest in peace. He might mumble a few words, take a sip of ale to wash down the damnation, burp politely, and leave. The job was done. The dead man's soul was clean. And the sin-eater? Well, he was now spiritually filthy. You see, people believe that by eating the bread, the sin-eater literally absorbed the dead person's sins into himself. That's why nobody wanted to touch him, talk to him, or marry his daughter. Because he was now basically a walking landfill of other people's moral failures. He wasn't part of the church. Priests disapproved of the practice, but people used sin-eaters anyway. They were often poor, isolated, and willing to trade their own spiritual cleanliness for a few coins, a crust of bread, and a pint of ale. And let's be honest, when rent's due, and all you've got to do is eat haunted toast, some folks might say yes. Over time, sin-eaters became living legends of doom. Villagers would point and whisper, "There he goes. Old John. Eaten 32 sins. Staggered after number 19, but kept going." And yet, no one thanked them. They weren't seen as heroes. They were tainted, cursed, even feared. Some said you could see the sins in their eyes. Some kids threw rocks at them, just to be safe. It was a lonely life. A disgusting one, but also a necessary one, at least for people who wanted Uncle Gregory's soul to skip purgatory and shoot straight into the VIP lounge of heaven. The job faded out by the 19th century, mostly in rural Wales and parts of England, but its legacy lives on in whispers, creepy legends, and possibly your sourdough starter. Too far? In summary, the sin-eater was a spiritual janitor, a one-man holy trash can, and arguably the original soul food delivery guy. He carried the sins of others, quietly, miserably, and with a side of stale bread, so that someone else could rest easy in the afterlife. So next time you bite into toast and think, this tastes weird, just be grateful you're not also swallowing Farmer Thomas's sins from 600 years ago. Ah, royalty. So elegant, so powerful, so delicate. Now imagine a prince. Spoiled, arrogant, 10 years old, and already convinced he's God's gift to the monarchy. He throws tantrums, flings apples at servants, forgets his Latin verbs, and refuses to study. Normally, a naughty child gets a good talking to. Or, in medieval times, a good whipping. But wait, you can't whip a prince. He's royal, chosen by God. Touching him, especially with something like a punishment stick, was considered practically blasphemous. So, what do you do when the prince misbehaves? You whip his best friend instead. No joke. Enter the whipping boy. Crown, who was he? A whipping boy was a young boy, usually from noble, but not royal, birth. He was raised alongside the prince. He ate with him, studied with him, played with him. They were meant to become besties. But unlike your average childhood friendship, this one came with a little catch. Every time the prince misbehaved, the whipping boy got punished instead. Forget getting grounded. Forget writing lines. If the prince didn't do his homework, the whipping boy got flogged. Imagine the teacher saying, "Your Highness, you forgot to recite your Latin declensions. Time to beat your friend again." And the prince is just sitting there like, I'll try harder next time. Maybe. Meanwhile, poor Oliver, or whatever his unfortunate name was, is sobbing and clutching his sore backside, probably wondering what career decisions led to this. Scroll why this actually made sense, sort of. The idea was psychological. Since you couldn't punish royalty physically, you'd punish someone he cared about. The hope was that the prince would feel such deep empathy and guilt for his friend's pain that he'd learn to behave better. Spoiler alert, that almost never happened. Many princes didn't care. Some even laughed while their whipping boy got beaten. Others used it as an excuse to slack off even more. Don't want to study today? No problem, just prep Timmy's back for another lashing. It was the medieval version of using someone else's email to sign up for spam. Adhesive bandage life as a whipping boy. Let's be clear, this wasn't some cozy castle gig. You lived under the constant threat of punishment for someone else's behavior. If the prince was moody, lazy, or downright bratty, you paid the price. Even worse, you were still expected to be his loyal companion. You had to laugh at his jokes, clap when he jousted, and nod approvingly as he demanded cake for breakfast. Imagine being bullied and contractually required to stay friends with your bully. But oddly enough, the job came with perks. If you survived childhood, the whipping boy was often rewarded handsomely later in life. Some were given estates, titles, or royal jobs. Why? Because they were usually one of the only people who truly knew the prince, and because kings like to keep their guilty secrets close. Plus, hey, a kid who suffered all your beatings and still didn't poison your soup? That's a keeper. Grinning face was wet and short. The whipping boy was the medieval human shield of discipline, the royal scapegoat, the emotional support punching bag. His job required loyalty, resilience, and a very high pain tolerance. It was a job where your success depended entirely on how bratty your best friend was. So next time someone says, "I'd love to be best friends with royalty," just pause and imagine a tutor walking in with a long stick and saying, "The prince forgot his lesson. Bend over, buddy." The Resurrectionist, aka the Body Snatcher. Yep, that's what they were called. Despite the fancy name, Resurrectionist, this was not a man of the cloth performing miracles. No, this guy was climbing into graves at night and yanking out corpses, and all in the name of science. Or at least, that's what he told himself when he couldn't sleep at night. So what exactly did he do? It's the 1700s, 1800s. Medicine is evolving. Doctors are realizing that cutting into people and learning how the human body actually works is kind of useful. Groundbreaking idea, right? But there's a problem. Cadavers, dead bodies used for dissection, are in very short supply. Back then, the only legal corpses for medical use were those of executed criminals, and honestly, there weren't enough murderers to go around. So what do medical schools do? They look the other way. And resurrectionists sneak into cemeteries at night, dig up freshly buried bodies, and sell them to anatomy professors like some grim DoorDash delivery. No headstone? No problem. If it was buried less than 3 days ago, you had a chance to cash in. Man zombie, how did they do it? It wasn't just shovel, grab, go. Oh no, this was a gruesome science of its own. They worked in teams. One guy would watch for trouble, one would dig, and another would grab the body. Medieval Ocean's 11, if you will, just with a lot more dirt and a lot less Brad Pitt. They never stole clothes or jewelry. That was considered theft, which was a serious crime. But stealing a naked body? That was somehow not illegal in many places. So yes, they'd strip the corpse, toss the clothes back in the coffin, and walk off with the body like it was a gym bag. They worked fast. Like Olympic level fast. The body had to be fresh, not too decomposed, and removed before anyone noticed. A good resurrectionist could dig, lift, and disappear within 30 minutes. That's faster than some people order pizza. They got creative. Some used long iron hooks to drag the body out without fully opening the coffin. Others used wooden boards to muffle the sound of digging. And some? They disguised themselves as mourners to scope out new inventory. Money bag, how much did they make? It was disturbingly profitable. A single cadaver could fetch the modern equivalent of hundreds, even thousands of dollars, especially if it was young, healthy, well, formerly, or rare in some way. Pregnant women and infants were tragically in demand due to anatomy studies. And since doctors were desperate and didn't ask too many questions, business was booming. Some resurrectionists even went full-time. No side hustle. Just grave robbing, 5 nights a week. Dental plan not included. Grimacing face the risks? Oh boy. Getting caught by the family. Some families literally stood watch at graves for days. This was called a mort vigil. Others hired guards or placed cages over graves called mort safes. Yes, metal cages over graves. Like zombie prevention, but for criminals. Getting caught by angry mobs. If villagers found out someone was digging up Granny, things got pitchforky real fast. Getting caught by the law. Eventually, laws tightened. In 1832, the UK passed the Anatomy Act, which allowed medical professionals access to unclaimed bodies from workhouses and prisons, putting most resurrectionists out of business. But until then, it was a morbid gold rush. Grinning face was wet and short. The resurrectionist was the Uber Eats of the underworld, the late-night grave whisperer, and possibly the only guy you'd fire for being early to work. He was equal parts thief, surgeon's assistant, and absolute lunatic, working by moonlight with a shovel, a rope, and probably zero sense of smell. So next time you see a skeleton in a doctor's office, just remember, somewhere, a 200-year-old man in a mud-stained cloak is nodding and saying, "Yeah, I delivered that one." Rat the rat catcher. Job description, pest control, plague wrestling, and occasionally screaming like a little girl. Let's start with a simple truth. In medieval times, rats were everywhere. In your walls. Under your floorboards. In your pantry. In your bed. And not the cute little cartoon rats with chef hats and dreams of running a Parisian bistro. No, these were greasy, disease-carrying, nightmare-fueled little monsters, and they ruled the cities like tiny, whiskered mob bosses. And where there are rats, there must be rat catchers. Gloves, who are they? Imagine a guy with a sack in one hand, a long stick in the other, possibly wearing a tunic that hasn't been washed since the last harvest festival. He walks into town, whistling a happy tune, but his mission? To track, trap, and remove as many rats as humanly possible. Basically, he was the medieval exterminator, except his tools didn't include poison or high-tech gadgets. No, this guy was armed with a bag, a stick, sometimes a ferret, and absolutely no fear of death or filth. Mouse, what did the job involve? 1. Setting traps. These weren't your sleek modern spring traps. Oh no. Rat catchers often used crude wooden boxes, sacks baited with spoiled meat, or just their bare hands if they were feeling particularly unhinged that day. Sometimes they'd pour honey or ale onto boards to attract rats. Other times, they'd let their pet ferrets chase rats into nets. Yes, some had rat-hunting ferrets, because why not bring a maniacal sausage-shaped predator to a rodent party? 2. Climbing into the worst places imaginable. Think you've had a dirty job? Rat catchers squeezed into gutters, sewers, barns, pantries, and that one dark corner under your bed no one talks about. There were no rubber gloves, no protective suits, just good old-fashioned reckless courage and a strong gag reflex. 3. Surviving the actual rats. Medieval rats were not polite. They bit. They swarmed. They were known to leap at faces. Rat catchers had to be quick, precise, and weirdly immune to rabies. Some even claimed to be rat whisperers, luring the creatures with sounds or whistles. Others swore by wearing the same stinky tunic every day to blend in with the environment. Whatever the method, it was never glamorous, and it was never safe. Petri dish the plague problem. Now, here's where things get real. Rats were often blamed for spreading the Black Death, that lovely 14th century pandemic that wiped out half of Europe. Did the rat catchers stop it? Not quite. But their jobs suddenly became wildly important. They were hired by desperate towns to hunt down rats before the plague could spread. Problem is, no one actually knew how plague transmission worked. Some thought it was bad air, others blamed sin, and a few probably pointed at goats. But the rat catcher? He was out there every night, wading through disease-infested alleys, risking plague, infection, and psychological trauma for a few coins and the satisfaction of hearing one less squeak. Money bag pay and perks, lol. Pay inconsistent. Some towns paid per rat. Others gave a flat rate. If you caught a giant rat, you might get a bonus or a free pint of ale. Perks: you got to sleep next to a bag full of dead rodents. Congratulations. Respect: somewhere between dung collector and guy who talks to rocks. But during a plague, you were suddenly everybody's hero. At least until they accused you of causing the rat problem and ran you out of town. Rat catching as a lifestyle. The job wasn't always about extermination. Some rat catchers captured rats alive and sold them to bloodletting doctors for experiments. Rich people's pets, yes, really? Or street performers who trained them to do tricks like jump through hoops. Imagine spending 3 hours in a sewer, nearly getting bitten to death, and then handing the rat over to a noblewoman who names it Sir Squeakerton, and feeds it cheese from a silver tray. Truly, the medieval working class suffered so nobility could giggle. Grinning face was wet and short. The rat catcher was a grimy legend, a walking biohazard, and possibly the reason towns didn't turn into full-blown rodent republics. He wasn't just chasing rats. He was chasing death, disease, and the eternal question of, what did I do in my past life to deserve this? So if you're ever feeling down about your job, just remember, you're not elbow deep in a rat-infested latrine, wearing a burlap sack yelling, "Come here, you little plague sponge!" At least, I hope not. Beer mug the ale taster. Job description: drink beer. Get paid. Try not to die. Before refrigerators, pasteurization, or Starbucks lattes, people in medieval Europe had a go-to beverage they could actually trust not to kill them: ale. Water? Unreliable. It could be filled with disease, rot, or parts of things you didn't want to know about. But ale, brewed with boiled water, hops, barley, and fermented to mild booziness, That stuff was liquid gold. And since nearly every medieval town had someone brewing ale, from professional brewmasters to your Aunt Mildred fermenting a bucket in her root cellar, someone needed to make sure it was safe to drink. Enter the ale taster. Clinking beer mugs. What did the ale taster do? Let's not kid ourselves. Yes, the ale taster's job was to drink beer. But this wasn't just a pub crawl in a tunic. This was official work, assigned by local governments. Their mission: taste every batch of ale brewed in the town to ensure it was safe, i.e. non-toxic, delicious enough, or at least not foul, and strong enough, but not too strong. We can't have townspeople getting drunk off one sip, unless it's festival season. They were, essentially, the health inspector and Yelp reviewer of the Middle Ages, but drunker. Sometimes way drunker. Castle, how did the job work? Every time someone brewed a new batch of ale, whether it was a commercial brewer, a monastery, or your slightly unhinged neighbor, the ale taster would be summoned. And then it went like this. He'd arrive with a wooden spoon or ladle. Fancy cups? This man drank out of tools. He'd take a generous gulp, swish it around like a sommelier, probably burp once or twice, and then deliver a verdict. Acceptable. White heavy check mark. Too weak. Unamused face. Too strong. Clinking beer mugs said with a smile, but still disqualified. Is this even ale? Nauseated face, often said while spitting behind a barn. If the ale passed, the brewer could legally sell it. If it failed, the whole batch might be dumped, and the brewer could be fined or even banned from brewing for a time. Balanced scale. What gave them authority? Ale tasting wasn't just some casual drinking gig handed to the town drunk with a good liver. These guys were appointed by the town council and were required to swear an official oath. They were also responsible for measuring ale prices. You couldn't overcharge for bad booze. Checking ale quality at markets and inns. Maintaining ale standards. Yes, there was such a thing. They were even given a badge or staff of office, proving that yes, they were a certified booze detective. Some wore special clothes or belts, and in some regions, they could just walk into your tavern, point at a barrel, and say, "Bring me the frothy one." You had to comply. Grinny face. What could go wrong? Oh, a few things. Drunk on the job. Shocking, right? Some ale tasters sampled a little too enthusiastically. There were cases of them getting completely plastered before lunchtime and declaring spoiled ale to be delightful and soul-affirming. Bribery. Brewers often tried to sneak a few extra coins or favors to get a passing grade, especially if their ale was more mystery fluid than drinkable. Sickness. Occasionally, the ale really was bad, contaminated, fermented too long, or just cursed by whatever lived in the brew barrel. Tasters sometimes ended up sick or with the medieval version of explosive regret. Pay and lifestyle? Decent pay. Some were salaried by the town, others earned a small fee per test. Free ale. Unlimited samples. You tell me that's not a perk. Respected position. Ale was a vital part of medieval daily life. Safer than water, part of workers' wages, even served to kids. Being in charge of it meant you mattered. You were basically the gatekeeper of the town's buzz. Smiling face with sunglasses in short. The ale taster was the only person in history who could be both drunk and doing his civic duty at the same time. He was the barrel-sniffing, pint-judging, foam-fearing champion of public safety and flavor. Sure, sometimes he made mistakes. And sure, sometimes he had trouble walking home. But darn it, he made sure your ale wouldn't kill you. So next time you raise a glass, toast to the medieval hero who made beer not just drinkable, but worth drinking. To the ale taster, clinking beer mugs. The knocker-up. Before alarms were invented, this was the person who came to your window and banged you awake. No, not like that. In today's world, we've got alarm clocks, phone alerts, and that one overly energetic friend who texts, "Wake up, bro, grind never stops," at 6:03 a.m. But rewind a few centuries, particularly to the late medieval period through the early Industrial Revolution, and things were a little more personal. If you needed to wake up early for work in a medieval or early modern town, you didn't set an alarm clock. You hired a human. A real person whose sole job was to come to your house every morning and wake you up. This was the mysterious and mildly hilarious profession of the knocker-up, also called the knocker-upper. Imagine this. You're a cobbler in 1442, or maybe a chimney sweep in 1780. You've got to be at work before the sun's up, but roosters can't be trusted, and nobody owns a clock. So you hire a knocker-up, someone who comes to your house at a specific time, and then they tap on your window with a long stick, or use a pea shooter to pelt tiny stones at the glass, or even bang on your door with a cane until you pop your sleepy head out. That was the entire job, waking people up. A human snooze button, except one that doesn't stop after 3 taps. And no, they didn't leave until they saw you were awake. Some even waited to make eye contact through the window like, "Yeah, I see you. Don't you dare go back to sleep, Jeremy." This gig was often picked up by elderly people, widows, those who weren't physically strong enough for hard labor, and even off-duty police officers looking for extra cash. It was one of the few jobs that required zero literacy, minimal tools, and high reliability. All you needed was a stick, lungs, and the ability to not oversleep yourself. Ironic, right? They didn't have uniforms, but the gear was very specific. A bamboo pole or long stick for knocking second-story windows. A shorter stick or cane for lower windows or doors. A pea shooter or slingshot for stealth mode awakenings. A notebook to keep track of clients and times. Like Google Calendar but grumpier. Funniest part? They often had to wake up earlier than everyone else. So yes, the knocker-up needed their own knocker-up. There are genuine reports of knocker UPS knocking on other knocker UPS windows to start the chain reaction of human alarms. It was like a domino effect of bleary-eyed professionals slapping buildings at 4 a.m. Of course, it wasn't always smooth. Some people slept through the knocking, leading to firmer knocks, and possibly cracked glass. Others pretended not to be awake, forcing the knocker-up to stay longer. And a few clients flat out refused to pay, claiming, "You never knocked," to which knocker UPS would probably respond, "Mate, I threw gravel at your face." The pay wasn't great. Just a penny or 2 per week per household. But if you had a good route of 30 to 40 clients, it added up. Some knocker UPS became local celebrities. Everyone knew them, trusted them, and probably hated them at 5 a.m., but respected them by breakfast. Why did this even exist? Because in the pre-alarm world, time was money, and people needed to show up to work. Oversleeping could mean losing your job, losing your day's wage, or getting scolded, whipped, or docked pay. So people gladly paid someone to ensure they got out of bed on time, even if it meant being woken up by a shriveled old man yelling, "Time for the mill!" Let's be honest, this was the original notification system. No snooze button. No do not disturb mode. Just a human being, probably half asleep themselves, aggressively poking your house with a stick until you opened your eyes. Imagine trying that today. Hello, sir, I'm your 6 a.m. wake-up stick banger. Please ignore the neighbors filing noise complaints. And even funnier, imagine being late to your own knocker-up job because your own knocker-up overslept. That's like a glitch in the matrix of medieval mornings. So next time your alarm clock beeps, just be glad it's not Doris from down the road launching dried peas at your window. The knocker-up, part alarm clock, part stalker, all professionalism.